So I want to just quickly run through a demo of declaring, defining events, and then handling events at the presentation tier. So this is my payroll class. You're familiar with this from Lab 2A and 2B. And I've added a definition of an event right up top, of course, with all of my other definitions. I've got something called class events. And this is an event, and it's declared, of course, as friend because it is accessible by anywhere inside this assembly, which could include a presentation tier or other business class. This event is called overtime. And the idea here is that I want this application to indicate, kind of give a nudge to the person who's working on data entry when overtime has been calculated. So like just kind of draw their attention to the fact it's like, wow, there's somebody in overtime. And we'll see exactly what the outcome of that is as we go through this. So I've defined this event as something called overtime. It will take as a single argument something we'll call a payroll instance. So it's an instance of the payroll class. Of course, its type is payroll. As I go down through the class methods here, I've got my find pay method, right? And I've got regular hours, I've got overtime rate, I've got overtime hours, I've got all this logic for determining regular pay and then overtime pay. And what I really do here is I check to see whether the employee hours are less than or equal to the regular hours, the 40 hours, the regular hours. If it is, then I go ahead and just calculate straight pay and set overtime hours to 0. Otherwise, so if it's not less than or equal to regular hours, and of course don't forget I've already had employee hours validated, right? So I know it's within range. If I find that it is greater than regular hours, then I have to calculate overtime pay. So I go ahead and I have my formula for calculating overtime pay. And then the last thing I do is that I raise the overtime event to be handled by the calling method or class. In this case, it's going to be the presentation tier. So I'm going to raise this event. The event is called overtime, and it's on the current object. And I just throw that out there to be handled. This thing was raised on a call to find pay. So back inside my payroll form, right, this is my button calculate click again. Once I've gotten through all of my try and catch, I've actually successfully assigned hours and rate, and they've passed validation at the business side. I call the find pay method on my pay object. It's at this point where an event is going to be thrown. It's not an exception. It's not something that's invalid at all. I continue on through find pay and I actually display pay, but I've got that overtime event that has been thrown. So I have to include this side because I expect this to occur. I need a handler for my overtime event. And here it is here. I've got this private sub overtime handler. It takes a single argument as defined in the class. It's a payroll object. In this case, we'll call it payroll. And it handles the pay object dot overtime. And all I'm doing with this is making this overtime label visible. There's the overtime label right there. It's just a red overtime pay included. So I turn visibility of that thing off and on depending on whether or not it's overtime. And I don't worry about anything in terms of calculating pay inside this click event. I let the find pay method of the object determine that and communicate that back to the presentation tier. So I'm going to set a breakpoint right here. And we'll go back to our payroll class application here, and we'll say I go ahead and calculate. So right off the bat, value enters outside the acceptable range, hours worked. Okay, so we'll say, okay, well, most this guy can work is 60, so we'll say 60. So look where I am right now. I'm in my payroll class. I'm in find pay. I start stepping through this, overtime hours. It goes ahead and assigns the overtime pay to the employee pay, but then it raises this event, overtime. Back before I even display the employee pay, the pay label on the form, I've got to handle that event that was thrown. And all I do is turn the visibility of that red label on. Overtime pay included. So events, and that is a key component of Lab 3B.